Hi there, thank you for tuning in. My contribution to the panel, Discourses of Organizational Socialization, Old Hat or New Normal, is a paper in development, so a paper that I'm currently working on, um, focusing on the discourse of onboarding. It is widespread among human resources practitioners, but I also think it's a really interesting discursive construct. And in particular, what is interesting currently is that during the COVID pandemic, we've seen a lot of talk about new working practices, not only in the media, but also among researchers. So what I'm also going to do here is kind of build a meeting place between media, research, and practice to kind of discuss the clash between these discussions about new working practices on the one hand and this discourse of onboarding, which, as I will show, is relatively or points to it being a relatively streamlined organization-led practice. As a kind of introductory remark, I thought I'd mention I recently attended a conference on electronic human resource management where I became further attuned to this, I call it processing language. So people processing talk is still quite widespread in that field. But interestingly, there was a panel discussion about whether the use of digital platforms could contribute to, or on the other hand, could counter what they discussed as dehumanization of human resource management practices. So I'd just like to introduce that to you as kind of a background as I go through my presentation here. So again, I'll introduce the project motivation, the rationale, and then I'll introduce scholarly approaches to onboarding, so terminology and definitions, and then zoom in on it more as an interpretative repertoire. So how can it be understood as an interpretative repertoire? And then, as mentioned, the empirical aspects are still work in progress, but here I will present some preliminary findings and some example data to support some of the conceptual work and especially the discussion that I would like to focus on here. So again, to really get to this discussion of, well, we have this discourse on the one hand, but there's these new developments in terms of working practices. Is that discourse really being challenged? So I'll be making some contributions in terms of theorizing, but also pointing to some practical implications. So for instance, in metaphor theory, we would say that using certain metaphors might have certain entailments, so things that we would connect to them, and things that maybe we wouldn't think about when using a certain metaphor. Okay, so the paper takes a discursive approach to scholarly discussions about onboarding, but also how onboarding is then conceptualized in organizational practice. So I draw on this idea about of interpretative repertoires, especially developed as part of Potter Wetherell's discursive psychology perspective. And so the question that I'm also getting at here is, what are some of the potential framing effects of onboarding discourse in research and in practice? So, and then, as I said before, also discussing, well, can some of those framing effects be challenged by these discussions of new work practices? Because again, I'm interested in this clash between how we've talked about new working practices during COVID versus, on the other hand, this monologilising onboarding discourse. So this idea of streamlined organization-led onboarding, which really, and this is where the link to the panel is, makes relevant a discussion of whether there really is a new normal as regards that aspect of working life. So first, I'll highlight some discussions of the definitions of onboarding. So to illustrate why it is that this discourse has the potential to have these monologilizing effects. Diving into the research literature, in the handbook on organizational socialization, which is linked to onboarding, Connie Warnberg notes that the term onboarding has been particularly popular in practice-oriented outlets and organizations, but we do also see it making its way into academia. So, for instance, in some of Bauer's work, she's to some extent saying that onboarding and, for instance, socialization are the same thing. And in some socialization research today, we really see more use of the term newcomer onboarding. But what Warnberg also says, and with reference to Klein and Polin, is that actually some of these terms should be differentiated because they don't mean quite the same thing. So Klein and Polin say, well, when they look at the kind of practices connected to onboarding, that makes them define it as all formal and informal practices, programs, policies enacted or engaged in by an organization or its agents to facilitate newcomer adjustment. So in a way, new onboarding signals that there is somebody who needs to or is going to be onboarded. So the critique here is that it focuses quite a lot on what the organization does. So it doesn't address the newcomer as an active participant. And again, to the extent that it does, it's much more about what does the organization want the newcomer to do. So in that sense, some aspects of onboarding are really closer to the literature on orientation and training, because in a way that the newcomer's agency is to some extent blurred. So onboarding, as also mentioned by other researchers, seems to refer to a more controlled process than the general idea of socialization. And also it's a temporarily limited practice. So really what it does is in a way it fails to include the co-construction, the negotiation going on between organizational agents and newcomers, and from a theoretical perspective, such processes have actually been recognized in earlier research. So what I do here is that I like to draw on some of the thoughts on discourse stemming from discursive psychology, especially those related to interpretative repertoires, because when I look into this this idea of onboarding, when I talk to people in the human resources community, this is much more than just a single metaphor. I really see onboarding as an interpretative repertoire because it is a whole cluster of related metaphors and ideas. So Potter Wetherell's definition is that interpretative repertoires are basically a lexicon or register of terms and metaphors drawn upon to characterize and evaluate actions and events. And in another work by Potter and colleagues, they also say that Well, interpretative repertoires are these broadly discernible clusters of terms, descriptions, commonplaces, figures of speech, also metaphors or vivid images, for instance, using distinct grammatical constructions and styles. So, what this use of onboarding as an interpretive repertoire does is it calls forth a certain version of practices connected to internal processes of welcoming newcomers in organizations. So, and again, the point I'm making here is that can then have some, perhaps for some problematic, like framing effects in terms of how guides are thinking about those practices. As I also discussed previously, there is this potential control ideology, and also in scholarly definitions of onboarding, and so this focus on this more streamlined organization-led practice to bring newcomers on board. And we see that carrying over into related practice and indeed related terms such as pre-boarding, reboarding, off-boarding. So all of, again, in a way returning to some of these old discussions about people processing. So there is this risk that really a practice that was intended to help newcomers actually becomes a very organization focused. And of course that is much less of a fit with the current talk about flexibility and new working practices. So in terms of the empirical aspects, I'm still deciding on which way to cut the cake, so to say. But what I like to do here is focus on some examples to also build on that in the discussion. So for instance, I'm looking at text data to investigate the discourse in the media. I'm looking at newsletters from onboarding software providers and interviews that I've done with both these human resource managers, but also onboarding software providers. And so on the one hand, looking at talk and writing about new working practices during the COVID-19 pandemic and onboarding during the pandemic. And then on the other hand, this conceptual background that I just introduced, where onboarding becomes a kind of monologizing repertoire. So I'll say a little about what I've so far found in the media and research literature and in some of these interviews and newsletters. So I've been looking into, so Infomedia is a Danish database of news published in news articles, radio. So I've been looking into that database where I could see that in a period from March to June 2022, there's, for instance, been discussions about digital nomads, but also CEOs who were increasingly unhappy with remote work. I also turned to the more scholarly literature, where perhaps the most interesting paper was by Dajun Wu and colleagues about how do you do water cooler talk when you're being socialized remotely. And what they point to in terms of definitions of onboarding, but also consequences in relation to having to do this remote, is that they say, well, onboarding is often used to highlight the business case of socialization. Again, the employer's point of view, so how to provide the right tools and training to increase productivity. So again, we see this organization bias in the focus, rather than this focus on helping the newcomers become integrated. And what the Jung Wu and her colleagues find is that when onboarding remotely, newcomers need to be much more proactive. But of course, the challenge here is that it's so far onboarding as a practice doesn't necessarily facilitate that newcomer proactiveness, and also it's simply not today a part of the imagery that discourse brings up. But what I'd like to do more here is to do some kind of co-location study. What are the words used in connection to each other here? The other part of the empirical material that I'm looking into interviews. So I've talked to people in startups before the COVID-19 pandemic, but they're also interesting here because you expect that some of these startups are developing practices that are perhaps more at the forefront, more innovative in terms of human resource management. And they do, but they also do reproduce some managerial ideas I can see in these interviews. I interviewed a human resource manager during COVID-19 who was talking about their examples with their own onboarding. So still, in a way, just moving the process online, not necessarily significantly changing what they wanted to achieve or how they wanted to achieve it. And then I had an interview with a consultant working for an onboarding software provider who was talking very much about how the software they were developing was very data focused. So some of the change going on here is that, well, we've moved from talking about onboarding to talking about remote onboarding, but whether there is really any significant change in the conceptualization is I'm still in doubt about that, also because onboarding was already a practice beginning to rely on digital means, even though people did physically meet in offices in the organization. So I'm not sure that this idea of remote onboarding necessarily changes that much in terms of how they're talking about some of these practices. Just as an illustration, this is a newsletter from Lepio, which is an onboarding software provider, from December 2021. And what they say is, well, the year is coming to a close, and if this year has taught us anything, it's how we do things is changing fast and unpredictable. So this, to some extent, also reproduces the discourse also seen in media at the time. And they're saying, well, organizations need to keep up in order to continue to attract and retain the employees. And then they write, this means that onboarding can no longer just be a checklist handled by the direct managers. Newcomers expect a proper introduction, especially to start a new work remotely. But you could say, for the second paragraph, well, is this really new? I mean, even before COVID, onboarding with just a checklist, was that necessarily good onboarding? So again, there's still this, onboarding as some kind of system or practice where human resources and the organization decides what to do, and it's not always that clear where thinking about the newcomers' needs actually factors in here. So again, they also talk quite a lot about professionalizing onboarding, but not necessarily how that has to do with the newcomers. So, is this really an old hat or a new normal? And the question that I would raise based on this is really, does adding remote to onboarding significantly change what we associate with the term? And so far the answer would, or at least a preliminary answer would be no. Another question here would be, well, does remote equal flexible or more control? Well, at least this is also a bit unclear. At the moment, there might be some things that are more flexible, but again, designing the process is still controlled. And then we have this idea of onboarding as something that's done to newcomers. Well, it still seems to be, to some extent. I haven't found much about efforts to actually facilitate newcomer proactiveness. So I'd also like to encourage a discussion about are there alternative repertoires that human resource practitioners could actually draw on here? Again, some of the challenges here is also, well, do we do onboarding based on traditional office presence, or in this new remote work reality, or does it even exist? Because there is also some evidence in the media, for instance, Elon Musk calling people back to the office. So we're also seeing some counter trends to the trends that emerged during the COVID pandemic. So although there are some new words and perhaps more frequent use of words such as remote and flexible during and after COVID, there are also some aspects of human resource practice that are just sticky, because basically the purpose on onboarding hasn't really changed. It's still, in human resource terms, about getting newcomers up and running, or helping them to hit the ground running. And the consequence is often that it's very much about delivering information to them. So what's interesting here is this idea about media representations versus research discussions, but also the kind of organizational reality or practice. And we also see that per definition repertoires are flexible. But on the other hand, onboarding seems to be a discourse which is relatively monologous. Also, as that idea or the imagery is carried over into terms such as pre-boarding, reboarding, and off-boarding. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to discussing with you at the conference.